At the wedding, my daughter-in-law publicly humiliated me in front of everyone. Her family laughed. My son stood there silent. I was pushed aside like I didn't matter. I turned my back, walked away, and said exactly 4 words. The entire room went dead silent. The room was full of flowers and light, the kind that makes everything look softer than it really is. White roses lined the aisle. Crystal glasses caught the glow of chandeliers and scattered it across the walls. People smiled the way they do at weddings wide and practiced as if happiness were a dress code. I stood among them in my best suit, hands folded, breathing in the smell of perfume and fresh linen, waiting for my son to take his place at the altar. I had imagined this moment for years, not the speeches or the music, but the quiet understanding that comes when a father watches his child step into a new life. I expected pride. I expected gratitude. What I did not expect was to feel invisible. Lauren noticed me before anyone else did. My daughter-in-law had a talent for that, for spotting weaknesses, the way some people spot stains on fabric. She moved toward me with a smile that never reached her eyes, her hand light on my arm, as if she were guiding an elderly relative out of traffic. Her voice was low and calm, perfectly polite and perfectly lethal. She spoke about seating and timing, about how things needed to look right for the photos. She said it would be better if I waited over there, not with the family, but closer to the back where the guests would be. Around us, her parents watched with amusement they did not bother to hide. Her mother's lips twitched. Her father leaned back, enjoying the moment. A few people glanced our way, sensed something was off, then looked away. Weddings are not places where anyone wants to get involved. I turned my head and looked for my son. Ethan was standing only a few feet away. He saw us. He saw her hand on my arm, saw the shift, understood exactly what was happening. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. Then he looked down. He said nothing. He did nothing. That was when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't nerves or stress. This had been decided long before the music started. I stepped aside as instructed, felt the space close around me, felt myself pushed gently but firmly out of the frame. When I finally turned to leave the room, I stopped once, just long enough to say 4 words. The music cut off mid-note. The laughter died. The silence was complete. They thought that was the end of me. They were wrong. I walked out of the ceremony alone, my footsteps steady, my back straight. No one followed. The doors closed behind me, muffling the sound of celebration, and with it, the last illusion I had been clinging to. I am Walter Hayes. I was 72 years old that day, and until recently, I believed I had done everything right. I built my company from nothing, poured concrete with my own hands, slept in trucks, missed birthdays, missed holidays, all so my son would never have to. When I retired, it wasn't because I was tired or incapable. It was because I believed it was time to step back and let the next generation lead. I handed Ethan the title of chief executive. I let him take the applause. I kept what mattered quietly and place ownership assets, the foundation of everything I had built. This wedding was supposed to mark that transition. It was meant to be a celebration of continuity of family. Instead, it showed me exactly how far I had already been pushed aside. As I crossed the parking lot, the cold air cut through my jacket. I welcomed it. It cleared my head. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine, replaying the scene in my mind. Lauren's smile, her parents' laughter, Ethan's silence. Each detail settled into place, forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about a chair or a row in a church. It was about control, about rewriting the hierarchy in front of witnesses. If I accepted that moment, if I smiled and played along, it would become the story everyone remembered. The aging father stepping aside gracefully, the new family taking over. I drove away without knowing exactly what I would do next, only that I would not beg for a place at a table I had built. That night, the calls started. Not from Ethan, from people who wanted to smooth things over, who told me not to take it personally, that weddings were stressful, that young couples made mistakes. I listened without responding. Apologies that explain away betrayal are not apologies at all. Ethan finally called the next morning. His voice was careful, measured. He talked about logistics, about honeymoon plans, about how busy everything was. He did not mention what had happened. He did not ask how I was. He suggested we talk later after things settled down. I told him we would talk when it mattered. Then I hung up. That was when I discovered my access had changed. Accounts I had used for decades suddenly required approval. Notifications arrived framed as security updates phrased in the language of concern. It was subtle, clever, and very intentional. Someone had decided that my independence was a risk. I could have called my lawyer immediately. I could have confronted Ethan, demanded explanations. Instead, I waited. I have learned over a lifetime that the most dangerous moves are the ones made too quickly. Over the next few days, pieces began to surface. A forwarded email that wasn't meant for me. A document attachment mislabeled. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Each small thing confirmed what the wedding had already made clear. I was no longer part of the inner circle. I was something to be managed. I thought back to the moment Lauren touched my arm. It hadn't been cruel in the way people expect cruelty to look. It was efficient, surgical, designed to leave no marks anyone could point to later. Her parents' laughter had done the rest, turning humiliation into entertainment. And Ethan's silence had sealed it. What hurt most wasn't the loss of respect. It was the realization that my son had allowed it, that he had watched them erase me and chosen the comfort of not choosing. That night, I poured myself a drink and sat alone in my study. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. I looked at the walls, at the framed photographs of construction sites, ribbon-cutting, smiling faces, from a time when success was something we shared. I understood then that what I was grieving wasn't just my place in the family. It was the belief that loyalty ran both ways. I didn't sleep much. When morning came, I felt strangely calm. Anger burns fast and leaves you blind. What I felt was colder, clearer. The kind of resolve that comes when you finally stop hoping things will fix themselves. By the end of that week, I had made a decision. I would not argue my worth. I would not demand respect from people who saw me as an inconvenience. If they wanted to move me out of the picture, I would let them try. They had mistaken my quiet for weakness. They had mistaken my trust for surrender, and they had no idea how much ground they were standing on still belonged to me. The wedding had been their opening move. My response would come later, and it would not be loud. It would be precise. As I closed the door to my study and turned off the lights, I thought again of those 4 words I had spoken before leaving the ceremony. I had chosen them carefully, not as a threat, not as an explanation, as a line, drawn where they least expected one. They were still celebrating. I was already planning. I left the reception hall without looking back. The doors closed behind me, with a dull, heavy sound that felt final, like a vault ceiling shut. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold, the kind that clears your lungs, whether you ask it to or not. I stood there for a moment, listening to the muffled music and laughter still spilling through the walls, and I realized something unsettling. No one followed me, not my son, not a single member of that room full of people who had just watched me be humiliated. I got into my car and sat there with the engine off. My hands rested on the steering wheel steady. I wasn't shaking. That surprised me. I had expected anger, maybe even rage. Instead, what I felt was distance, like I had stepped back from a painting and finally saw the full picture instead of the brushstrokes. For years, I had told myself that stepping aside was the right thing to do. I was 72 years old. I had built my company from nothing but long days, broken knuckles, and a stubborn refusal to quit. When my wife passed, the world lost some of its color, and I convinced myself that easing my son into control was a kindness, a gift. I told myself that guiding him quietly from the background was wisdom, not weakness. That night in the car, I finally admitted the truth. I hadn't stepped aside because I trusted him. I stepped aside because I was tired, and tired men make generous mistakes. I drove home slowly, not because I didn't know the way, but because I needed the time. Every red light felt like an invitation to think. I replayed the wedding in my head, not the insults themselves, but the small details. The way my daughter-in-law's smile never reached her eyes, the way her parents laughed a second too long, and most of all, the way my son stood there, hands folded, eyes down, as if silence were a neutral position. By the time I pulled into my driveway, something had settled inside me. A decision quiet but solid. I wasn't going to call anyone. I wasn't going to demand explanations, not yet. Inside the house, everything was exactly as I'd left it. Clean, ordered, familiar. The kind of place people assume belongs to a man who has control over his life. I poured myself a glass of water instead of whiskey. I wanted my head clear. Then I went into my study and turned on the desk lamp, the same one I'd used for decades. I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in a while. Inside were documents most people assume disappear once a man retires: deeds, trust agreements, old contracts yellowed at the edges. I didn't open them right away. I just sat there looking at the folder, letting the weight of it remind me of something important. Control doesn't vanish unless you give it away completely, and I hadn't. The next morning I woke early the way I always had. Habit is a hard thing to break. Sunlight crept through the curtains, and for a moment, everything felt almost normal. Then my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from my son. "Dad, about last night, things got out of hand. Let's talk." No apology, no acknowledgement. Just a request to smooth things over the way people do when they're more concerned about consequences than cause. I didn't reply. I put the phone face down and made myself breakfast slow and deliberate. Later that morning, I logged into one of my personal accounts, more out of routine than suspicion. I like to keep an eye on things, even if nothing ever changed. Except this time, something had. The layout looked the same, but a small notification caught my attention. Viewing permissions updated. I stared at the screen, reading it again, to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. I hadn't authorized any changes. My pulse didn't quicken. If anything, it slowed. This wasn't theft. This was positioning. I checked another account, same thing, minor adjustments, nothing dramatic, nothing illegal on the surface, just enough to limit visibility, just enough to suggest someone was preparing for a future where my questions wouldn't matter. That was when the memory of the wedding shifted in my mind. The humiliation hadn't been the point, it had been rehearsal. I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For the first time since my wife died, I felt something close to focus. Loss had dulled me, but clarity has a way of cutting through fog fast. Around noon, my daughter-in-law called. Her voice was bright, almost cheerful, the way people sound when they're trying to control a situation without appearing to. "Walter, I just wanted to check in," she said. "We were worried about you leaving so abruptly. Weddings can be overwhelming. Overwhelming, as if I had wandered off, confused." I listened, letting her talk. She mentioned stress, health, rest. She suggested I take a few days to myself. Maybe unplug. I agreed with everything she said, out loud. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time staring at the phone. They weren't pushing yet. They were softening the ground, making sure that when the real move came, it would look reasonable, compassionate even. That afternoon, I went for a walk around the neighborhood. People waved, smiled, asked how the wedding was. I told them it was beautiful. I didn't lie. It had been beautifully revealing. When I returned home, there was an email waiting for me from a law office I didn't recognize. The subject line was bland, almost polite. Estate clarification. I read it slowly. It spoke about planning contingencies, making sure everything was in order, given my recent life changes. No accusations, no threats, just concern wrapped in professional language. I closed my laptop and sat in silence. The shape of the thing was clear now. This wasn't about taking something from me. It was about deciding quietly and collectively that I was finished. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I felt safe, but because uncertainty was gone. I knew where I stood. And more importantly, I knew where they thought I stood. They believed I was wounded, confused, manageable. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and let a small, almost imperceptible smile form. They had mistaken restraint for surrender, silence for absence. The next phase wouldn't begin with anger. It would begin with patience. And patience, I had learned over a lifetime, was the most dangerous thing a man like me could possess. I did not confront anyone the next day. That was the first thing I decided, and it felt strangely powerful. For most of my life, when something was wrong, I addressed it directly. I believed problems shrank under the weight of clear words and steady eyes. But this situation was different. Directness was what they expected from me. What they didn't expect was restraint. The morning after the email from the law office, I went about my day as if nothing had changed. I answered a few routine calls. I returned a message from an old supplier who still treated me like I mattered. I even sent my son a short reply, neutral and calm. "We'll talk soon." Nothing more. Soon is a word people hear as reassurance. To me, it meant nothing of the sort. I spent the afternoon in my study not reading documents yet, just organizing my thoughts. I took out a legal pad and wrote down a single question at the top of the page. When did this start? Not the wedding. Not the email. When did the shift actually begin? Patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat quietly until you notice. I thought back to small moments I had dismissed over the past year. Meetings I wasn't invited to because they were operational. Decisions that were presented to me after the fact already framed as settled. Jokes made at my expense that were supposed to be affectionate but carried an edge. At the time I had blamed age, grief, my own withdrawal. It was easier than assuming intention. Now intention was impossible to ignore. In the early evening, my son stopped by unannounced. That alone would have been unusual a year ago. He used to call first, ask. Now he simply appeared as if the boundary between my life and his had softened without my consent. He looked tired, not worried exactly, more like a man carrying a weight he hadn't expected to feel so heavy. "Dad," he said, standing in the doorway, not stepping fully into the room. "I thought we should talk in person." I gestured for him to sit. He chose the chair across from my desk, the same one countless partners and rivals had sat in over the years. He didn't meet my eyes right away. He started with concern. He always did, asked how I was feeling, mentioned stress, the wedding, the past year. He spoke carefully, like someone following a script they hadn't written themselves. At one point he said, "You've been through a lot. We just want to make sure you're protected." Protected. That word again. I nodded. From what he hesitated, just long enough. "Well, from making things harder on yourself," he said, "from unnecessary strain." I let the silence stretch. Silence makes people fill it with truth. He added, "You know, decisions get more complicated as time goes on. It helps to have support." Support in his mouth sounded like supervision. I asked him a simple question. "Who suggested the law firm that emailed me yesterday?" His head snapped up. For the first time, he looked directly at me. Surprise flickered across his face before he masked it. "What email?" he asked. There it was. The first lie told too quickly. I didn't correct him. I simply nodded as if accepting his answer. His shoulders relaxed almost immediately. He assumed the moment had passed. We talked a little longer, about nothing that mattered. When he left, he patted my shoulder in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost rehearsed. After the door closed, I remained seated, staring at the empty chair across from me. That was when I knew. The lie wasn't meant to deceive me completely. It was meant to test whether I was still paying attention. Later that night, I called an old acquaintance who had stayed loosely connected to the company after I stepped back. Not a close friend, someone peripheral enough to speak freely. I asked him a casual question about a meeting I had heard mentioned in passing. He laughed. "You didn't know they've been meeting regularly. Planning phase, they called it. Long-term continuity." Continuity of what I wondered. Of me or without me, I thanked him and hung up. Then I went back to my desk and finally opened the folder I had avoided. Deeds, trust documents. Agreements written in language that had once protected me and now potentially protected me from something worse. Everything was still in my name where it mattered. The structure was intact. That brought relief, but also something else. Urgency. The next morning, I received a forwarded email by mistake. It came from an assistant who had worked with me for years before being reassigned. The message was brief, logistical, and clearly not meant for me. It referenced a document I hadn't seen attached to a meeting agenda scheduled for later that week. The language was dense. Too dense for my son, who had always preferred summaries to details. Someone else had drafted it. Someone careful. I didn't respond. I saved it. Over the next few days, I did something that would have looked like disengagement to anyone watching. I canceled a lunch. I skipped a call. I didn't comment on a decision that would have once drawn my attention. Each absence was deliberate, and each absence was rewarded. They moved faster. Decisions were made without my input. Changes were implemented quietly. My lack of objection was taken as agreement. I could almost hear the collective exhale. They believed the hardest part was over. In the quiet moments between these observations, something uncomfortable surfaced. Grief, not for the power I was losing, but for the relationship I thought I had with my son. I had raised him to speak up, to defend what mattered. Somewhere along the way, I had taught him that comfort was the same as security. That realization hurt more than the wedding ever could have. One evening, as I sat alone with the lights low, I connected the last pieces: the public humiliation, the softened narrative about my health, the legal language creeping into casual conversations. It wasn't a series of unrelated events. It was a sequence. First diminish, then isolate, then justify intervention. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being managed. I closed my notebook and placed it in the drawer. The page with the original question stared back at me one last time before disappearing into the dark. When did this start? It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this. They believed I was stepping aside. They believed my silence meant consent. They believed my patience was weakness. I turned off the lamp and stood in the dark, listening to the house settle around me. The creaks and hums were familiar grounding. This place still knew who I was, even if the people closest to me had forgotten. I had learned everything I needed to know. The truth was no longer hidden. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged, and I was done reacting. From here on, every move would be mine. The first lie they told me was small enough to slip past anyone who wasn't listening carefully. That was the point. Big lies demand defense. Small ones just need indifference. It happened 2 days after my son's visit. I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone rang. It was him again, voice light, almost casual. "Dad, quick thing," he said. "We moved one of the advisory meetings next week. Nothing important, just routine." Routine. Another soft word. I asked him where the meeting had been moved to. He hesitated, then named a location I knew well. Too well. It was a conference room reserved for board-level discussions, the kind that required formal notice and documentation. I knew the rules because I had written half of them myself. "Good," I said. "Send me the agenda when you have a chance." There was a pause on the line just long enough to register. "Of course," he replied. "I'll forward it later." He never did. I didn't remind him. I didn't follow up. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and went on with my day. On the surface, nothing had happened. Underneath, something fundamental had shifted. That afternoon, I received a call from a woman who had worked with our company for over a decade. She wasn't part of management. She handled logistics, the kind of person who saw everything and was expected to say nothing. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling," she said carefully. "I just wanted to make sure you were aware of the change." "What change?" I asked. "The consultants," she said. "They're coming in earlier than planned. I assumed you approved it." There it was. A second version of the same story delivered without malice, without awareness. Two explanations that couldn't both be true. I thanked her and hung up my hand, steady on the phone. The lie wasn't in the details. It was in the assumption that I wouldn't compare notes. That evening, I took out a legal pad and wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. What else are they deciding without me? I didn't have to wait long for an answer. The next morning, an email landed in my inbox, clearly sent to the wrong recipient. It was brief, professional, and written in a tone that assumed familiarity. It referenced a document attached below something called a preliminary framework. I didn't open the attachment right away. Instead, I read the email twice, then a third time. The language was precise, clinical, not my son's voice at all. When I finally opened the file, the first thing I noticed wasn't the content, it was the formatting. The structure mirrored documents I had seen only a handful of times in my career, always in situations involving legal contingency, succession, authority, capacity. I closed the file and sat back, letting the quiet of the room settle around me. They weren't improvising anymore. They were executing. Later that day, my daughter-in-law stopped by. She didn't call first. She never did. She moved through my house like it belonged to her, already setting her bag down on the counter, scanning the space with quick, assessing glances. "I wanted to check on you," she said, her voice warm, almost affectionate. "You've been so quiet lately." "I've been busy," I replied. She smiled. "Of course you have, but you don't have to carry everything yourself anymore." There it was again, that careful framing, not concern, transition. She poured herself a glass of water without asking and leaned against the counter. "We've been talking," she said, "about the future." I waited. "It's important that things stay stable," she continued, "for everyone involved, for whom I asked." She waved a hand vaguely. "The business, the family, you." I nodded slowly. "And how do you propose to do that?" Her smile tightened, just slightly. "By making sure decisions are handled efficiently, without unnecessary stress. Unnecessary stress. The implication hung between us heavy and deliberate. I thanked her for her concern. She seemed relieved by my calm, as if she had braced for resistance and been pleasantly surprised by my compliance. When she left, she hugged me brief and perfunctory, like someone checking off a box. After the door closed, I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where she had been. The first lie had been simple. There was no emergency meeting, no harmless scheduling change. There was a deliberate effort to move things out of my line of sight quietly and confidently. That night, I made a decision. I would stop pretending not to notice. I didn't confront them. I did something far more revealing. I disappeared. I skipped a standing call I had attended for years. I didn't comment on a draft proposal sent to me out of courtesy rather than necessity. I let messages go unanswered just long enough to suggest distraction, not suspicion. The effect was immediate. They accelerated. Meetings multiplied. Decisions stacked up. My absence wasn't questioned. It was welcomed. In their minds, I had finally done what they needed me to do. I had stepped aside without a fight. What they didn't understand was that stepping back had always been my strongest position. In the days that followed, fragments of information reached me from different directions. A reference to legal counsel I hadn't approved. A casual remark about contingency planning. A calendar invite labeled vaguely enough to avoid scrutiny. One phrase appeared more than once, tucked into different conversations like a shared code. Once, Walter is settled. Settled, as if I were a problem to be solved. I sat alone in my study one evening, the lamp casting a small circle of light on the desk. Around me, the room was filled with the quiet evidence of a life built deliberately. Books I had read, files I had created, decisions I had owned. I thought about the wedding again, about the way I had been pushed to the side, treated like an inconvenience. At the time, I had believed that moment was about disrespect. Now I saw it for what it truly was. It was permission. They had tested the room. They had watched who laughed, who looked away, who stayed silent. And when no one objected, they moved forward, including my son. That realization settled into me slowly, like cold water seeping through fabric. He hadn't been trapped. He hadn't been confused. He had made a choice. Silence when it matters is alignment. The clarity was almost calming. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened yard. Somewhere inside the house, the furnace kicked on, steady and reliable. Systems working as designed. That thought made me smile faintly. They believed they were managing an old man. They believed kindness would keep me docile, that omission would keep me ignorant. They were wrong. The first lie wasn't meant to fool me forever. It was meant to measure me, to see if I would challenge it, expose it, resist it. I hadn't done any of those things, and because of that, they had shown me everything I needed to see. I turned off the lamp and let the room go dark. In the quiet, I felt no anger, no urge to confront or accuse, only resolve. They thought I was fading into the background. What they didn't understand was that the background is where patterns become visible, and I was done pretending not to see them. I couldn't do this alone. That realization came to me quietly without drama, while I was standing at the sink, washing a single plate I hadn't even used. Power without precision is just noise, and noise was exactly what they wanted from me. An outburst, a confrontation, proof that I was unstable, emotional, difficult to manage. I wasn't going to give them that. I needed someone who understood systems the way I did. Someone who knew how power actually moves when people stop speaking plainly. Someone they had already pushed aside because she wouldn't bend. Her name came to me while I was drying my hands. It surprised me how quickly it surfaced, as if my mind had been holding it in reserve. Margaret Cole. Margaret had been the company's chief legal counsel for almost 15 years. Not flashy, not loud, meticulous. She was the kind of lawyer who read every footnote and remembered every exception. She had protected the company through lawsuits, regulatory audits, and one particularly ugly hostile takeover attempt that no one ever talked about because it failed so completely. She was also the person my son had fired 6 months after I stepped back. At the time, he told me it was about culture, fresh perspective, alignment. The usual language people use when they want to remove friction without admitting they dislike resistance. I hadn't challenged it. I had been grieving, distracted, willing to believe his judgment deserved space. Now I understood exactly why she had been let go. I didn't call her right away. I sat with the idea for a full day, testing it from every angle. Reaching out would be an escalation, even if it didn't look like one on the surface. It would mean admitting, at least to myself, that this was no longer a family misunderstanding. It was a strategic conflict. The next morning, I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring. "Walter," she said, calm and unsurprised. "I wondered when I'd hear from you." That alone told me more than any document could have. We agreed to meet that afternoon at a small cafe, halfway between her home and my office. Neutral ground, no glass walls, no assistants hovering nearby. When I arrived, she was already there, seated at a corner table with a cup of tea and a thick folder resting beside her chair. She stood when she saw me, her expression warm but serious. "You look thinner," she said. "So do you," I replied. She smiled briefly, then gestured for me to sit. For a moment, we talked about nothing. The weather, the traffic, mutual acquaintances we both knew well enough to discuss safely. It felt almost absurd, this careful dance, given what hung between us. Finally, she set her cup down and looked directly at me. "You didn't call to reminisce," she said. "Tell me what you know. Not what I wanted, not what I suspected, what I knew." That was when I understood why I had trusted her for so long. I told her everything. The wedding, the silence, the small changes to my accounts, the email from the law office, the documents I hadn't been shown but had been referenced. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften the details. I let the facts speak for themselves. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When I finished, she nodded once, as if confirming something she had already concluded. They started earlier than I thought, she said. I felt a chill move through me. Earlier, she reached down and opened the folder at her feet. Inside were copies of emails, memos, and draft documents, all neatly organized. "This is why they fired me," she said, or at least this is what they were trying to keep me from challenging. She slid a document across the table toward me. It wasn't signed, it wasn't finalized, but it didn't need to be. The intent was unmistakable. It outlined a contingency plan, carefully worded, professionally justified. It referenced concerns about capacity, decision fatigue, long-term sustainability. It framed intervention as protection, oversight as compassion. My name appeared throughout, paired with phrases like temporary authority transfer and best interest review. I felt my jaw tighten, but my voice stayed steady. "How long ago was this drafted?" 4 months, she said. "Maybe 5. That's when I pushed back. Pushed back how I told them it was premature, she said, that there was no evidence to support it, that it would be unethical without clear cause. And they stopped inviting me to meetings," she said simply. 2 weeks later, they terminated my contract. The air between us felt heavy now, thick with implication. "They weren't waiting for something to happen to me," I said. "They were preparing to make something happen." Margaret nodded. "Exactly." I leaned back in my chair, staring out the cafe window without really seeing anything. The wedding humiliation hadn't been a spontaneous cruelty. It had been phase 1, a public test. Would I react? Would I lose control? Would there be witnesses? When I hadn't, they adjusted, softened their approach, moved toward documentation instead of provocation. "They want to present me as a risk," I said quietly. "Not dangerous, just inconvenient." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "That's the most effective way to remove someone like you." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the truth settling fully between us. Finally, I asked the question that had been forming since she opened the folder. "What do we do?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a sip of her tea, then met my gaze again. "There are 2 options," she said. "You can confront them now, force the issue, demand explanations, stop whatever process they've started. And the other, you let them continue," she said. "You document everything. You allow them to cross a line that can't be explained away as concern." I frowned. "That sounds risky." "It is," she agreed, "but it's also decisive." I thought about my son, about the way he had lied too quickly, about the way he had avoided my eyes, about the way he had allowed his wife and her parents to define the room while he stood silent. "They're already confident," I said. "They think I'm retreating." Margaret allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "Then let them believe it." The plan took shape, slowly, deliberately. No grand gestures, No sudden moves. The key was patience and timing. If we interrupted too early, they would retreat and adjust. If we waited too long, the damage could become irreversible. They're relying on the assumption that you won't notice until it's too late, Margaret said, or that if you do, you'll panic. I exhaled. I'm not panicking. No, she said. You're preparing. When we finally stood to leave, the sun was already lowering, casting long shadows across the street. Margaret gathered her folder and paused. There's one more thing you should know, she said. They've been careful, but they're also impatient. They want closure, control. That's a weakness, I said. Yes, she agreed, and it's the one we'll use. That night back at home, I sat alone in my study again. The same desk, the same lamp. But everything felt different now. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by something colder and far more useful. They weren't reacting to me anymore. They were moving according to a plan they believed was uncontested. I took out my phone and scrolled through old contacts until I found her number again. I saved it under a new name. Not for secrecy, for clarity. Ally. For the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel isolated. I felt positioned. They thought they were slowly removing me from the equation. What they didn't realize was that they had already revealed the entire formula. And now, I knew exactly how to solve it. The silence after the wedding wasn't accidental. I understood that fully now, sitting alone in my study as the late afternoon light slanted across the shelves. Silence like that doesn't happen by chance. It is chosen, practiced, and deployed when someone decides that speaking would cost more than staying quiet. I replayed the moment again, not the laughter, not the insult, but my son's face, the way his jaw tightened, the way he stared past me as if I weren't standing there at all. At the time, I had told myself he was overwhelmed, caught off guard, afraid of making things worse. Fathers are very good at inventing reasons to protect their children from judgment, even when those children are grown men. Now I knew better. The 4 words I had spoken before leaving the wedding hall had already begun to travel. Not verbatim, but reshaped, softened. I heard about it the next morning from a mutual acquaintance who called under the pretense of checking in. You really scared some people, she said lightly. They were worried about you. Worried. Another careful word. I asked her what she meant, and she hesitated, then laughed it off. You know how people talk. They just thought you seemed upset. Upset was generous. Unstable would come later. By noon, the narrative had grown arms and legs. I didn't hear it directly, not yet. I felt it instead in the way conversations ended more quickly and the way voices lowered when my name came up. Concern is the most effective disguise for control. Wrapped properly, it sounds like kindness. That afternoon, I logged into one of my long-standing financial accounts, the kind I rarely touched anymore. I expected everything to be exactly as it always had been. Instead, a small banner appeared at the top of the screen, polite and unobtrusive. Some features may be limited based on updated access settings. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I clicked through the menus, slowly, methodically. Nothing dramatic was missing. No funds moved. No accounts closed. But visibility had been narrowed. Notifications rerouted. Secondary authorization added. Someone hadn't taken anything yet. They were building a fence. I made a note and logged out. Then I checked another account. Same pattern, different interface, same outcome. Each change taken alone was explainable. Together, they formed something else entirely. Preparation. I didn't call the bank. I didn't ask questions. I wanted to see how far they would go if they thought I was unaware. The answer came sooner than expected. That evening, my son called. His tone was measured calm, almost soothing, the voice he used when he wanted to sound responsible. Dad, I heard you left the wedding early, he said. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I told him I was fine. There was a pause. Then Emily's been worried. We all have. We all. A phrase meant to create consensus where none had been earned. I appreciate the concern, I said, but I'm managing. He exhaled audibly. You don't have to manage everything yourself anymore. That's all I'm saying. There it was, the line he'd rehearsed. I never said I did, I replied. Another pause. Longer this time. Well, he said, things are changing. That's natural. Are they? I asked. Yes, he said quickly. As time goes on, responsibilities shift. I let the silence stretch. I could almost hear him listening for something waiting for me to argue, to object, to assert myself the way I used to. Instead, I said, if that's the case, I trust you'll keep me informed. Of course, he said too fast. Absolutely. We ended the call shortly after. I sat there with the phone still in my hand, feeling something settle into place inside me. Not anger, something colder, more precise. Later that night, I received an email forwarded by mistake. It came from an assistant who had been reassigned months earlier, someone who still thought of me as part of the chain. The subject line was vague, internal coordination. The body of the email referenced a scheduled consultation, legal and medical professionals, framed as precautionary, no urgency, no alarm, just process. The phrase that stopped me cold was buried halfway down. Given recent behavior, we should be prepared. Recent behavior. 4 words spoken calmly at a wedding after being publicly humiliated had already been transformed into evidence. I closed the email and sat back, my fingers laced together on the desk. So, this was the shape of it. Not confrontation, not theft, but repositioning me as a liability. I thought about the wedding again, about how many people had been watching. Family, friends, business associates, community figures, witnesses, whether they knew it or not. That humiliation hadn't been impulsive. It had been deliberate. They needed a moment they could point to later, something ambiguous enough to reinterpret. And my son had stood there silent while it happened. The realization hit harder than anything else. Not because of betrayal, but because of clarity. Silence wasn't his weakness. It was his consent. The next day, I decided to test a theory. I skipped a standing meeting I had attended for years. No explanation, no apology. I wanted to see what happened when I wasn't present to anchor things. What happened was telling. Decisions were made anyway, not deferred, not questioned, proceeded. I heard about them later secondhand, already framed as fait accompli. My absence hadn't slowed anything down. It had accelerated it. That was when I understood their mistake. They believed I was disengaging. They believed I was retreating into age, into grief, into irrelevance. What they didn't understand was that I was watching. In the quiet moments between calls and emails, grief crept in. Not loud, not dramatic. A steady ache. I thought about the boy I had raised, the lessons I had tried to teach him about standing up, about speaking when it mattered. Somewhere along the way, he had learned a different lesson. That comfort was worth more than courage. I didn't blame his wife entirely. She was ambitious, sharp, accustomed to control. She saw an opening and moved. That much I could understand. What cut deeper was knowing my son had let it happen, because it was easier than resisting. That evening, I stood by the window and watched the lights come on across the neighborhood. Ordinary lives unfolding, people unaware of the quiet wars being fought in offices and living rooms, behind closed doors. I felt strangely calm. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligned. This wasn't about money, not yet. It was about authority, about narrative, about who would be believed when the question of my capacity was finally asked out loud, and it would be asked. Soon. I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk. I opened a drawer and took out an old address book, the paper kind I had kept, long after most people moved everything into their phones. I flipped through the pages slowly until I found a name I hadn't spoken aloud in months. Margaret Cole, the lawyer they had pushed out. I didn't call her that night. I wasn't ready yet. But my finger rested on the page longer than necessary, tracing the ink absent-mindedly. They thought the wedding had broken me. They thought silence meant surrender. They were wrong on both counts. The silence had given me something invaluable. Time. And time, when used properly, has a way of exposing every hidden intention. I closed the drawer, turned off the light, and went upstairs. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, one thought repeated itself with steady certainty. They were moving faster now, which meant they were getting careless. And that was exactly what I needed. The room smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee, the kind of smell that never quite leaves hospitals, no matter how often they clean. I lay back against the pillows, the thin blanket pulled up to my chest, my hands resting openly where anyone could see them. The monitor beside the bed beeped steadily, a quiet rhythm meant to reassure me and to suggest fragility. I let it. The episode itself had been simple, a brief spell of dizziness, a controlled collapse in the hallway of a hotel where people knew my name. Nothing dramatic, no ambulance sirens, just enough concern to justify observation, just enough vulnerability to invite intervention. By the time my son arrived, the story had already written itself. He came in with his wife at his side, both of them wearing the same expression, concern, carefully measured urgency wrapped in politeness. She moved first, always did, greeting the nurse by name, asking questions with an authority she hadn't earned, but expected to be recognized. I watched them without lifting my head. It was important that they believed what they were seeing. "Dad," my son said softly, stepping closer to the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," I replied. I let my voice thin, let the word linger. A little confused. That one landed exactly where I wanted it to. His wife exchanged a glance with him, quick and loaded. She turned to the nurse and smiled. "We were worried something like this might happen," she said. "He's been under a lot of stress." The nurse nodded sympathetically. Concern accepts any explanation that sounds reasonable. Once we were alone, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, thick, well-organized tabs, already in place. She held it the way someone holds something they believe belongs to them. "These are just precautions," she said, placing it on the tray table beside my bed. "Temporary, just until everything settles." I looked at the folder as if it were slightly out of focus. "What is it?" "Paperwork," my son said quickly. "Hospital policy, medical authorization, financial oversight, just in case, just in case." 3 words people use when they want you to stop asking questions. "I don't remember agreeing to this," I said. "You don't need to," his wife replied gently. "That's the point." She opened the folder, flipping through pages with practiced ease. I noticed how she avoided lingering on any single page, how her fingers moved confidently without hesitation. She knew what she wanted me to sign. She also knew I wouldn't be given time to read. "You've always trusted us," she continued. "This doesn't change that." I turned my head slightly, as if gathering strength, and looked at my son. His eyes flicked away almost immediately. "Is this necessary?" I asked him. He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. "We just want to protect you," he said, "until you're feeling more like yourself." More like yourself. As if who I was now had already been redefined without my consent. I sighed and reached for the pen, my hand shaking just enough to sell the performance. "I don't want to be a burden. You're not," he said too quickly. His wife slid the first page toward me. "Just sign here." I scanned the page slowly, deliberately. The language was dense, legalistic, designed to intimidate, to rush. I let my eyes move across the words, without reacting, without recognition. Beneath the surface, text beneath the layout they expected me to see was something else entirely. A different agreement, a different purpose. The pages had been altered, not crudely, subtly. The order shifted, the headings adjusted. To anyone skimming, it was exactly what it claimed to be. To someone who knew how these things worked, it was something else. It was a financial instrument, personal, binding. A loan agreement structured to trigger obligations they hadn't read closely enough to understand. My hand paused above the signature line. "Dad," my son said. "Are you okay?" "I just need a moment," I replied. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." His wife's smile tightened. "Of course. But the doctor will be back soon. It would be better to finish this now." Pressure, always pressure. I looked at my son again. "You're sure about this?" He swallowed. "It's for the best." That was the moment something broke inside me. Not loudly, not visibly, just a quiet acceptance. The son I had raised wasn't standing in front of me anymore. What stood there was a man who had chosen ease over integrity and called it responsibility. I signed. Once. Then again. Each stroke, slow, deliberate. The pen felt heavy in my hand, as if it understood the weight of what was happening better than anyone else in the room. His wife took the folder, immediately closing it with a satisfied snap, as if afraid I might ask for it back. "Thank you," she said. "This will make everything much easier." They left shortly after citing calls they needed to make arrangements to handle. My son hesitated at the door, looked back once, then followed her without saying anything. When the door closed, the room felt suddenly larger, emptier. A few minutes later, a woman in scrubs entered quietly. She wasn't a nurse, not really. The badge said she was, but the way she moved gave her away. Confident, precise. Margaret had always been like that. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, listening. Then she crossed the room and picked up the discarded pen. "Well," she said softly, "they didn't read it." I let out a breath I'd been holding since they arrived. I didn't expect them to. She sat in the chair beside the bed and opened her own folder, identical on the outside, completely different on the inside. "It's valid," she said. "Enforceable. Every clause." "What about timing?" I asked. "They'll move quickly," she replied. "They think they've secured control. That kind of confidence makes people reckless." I nodded. "Good." She studied my face for a moment. "Are you all right?" I considered the question honestly. "I will be." She stood and adjusted the blanket slightly, a small human gesture in the middle of something cold and procedural. "Once they act on it," she said, "there's no undoing it." "I know," I replied. "That's why I let them." After she left, I lay back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the monitor resume its steady rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rattled. A voice laughed briefly, then disappeared. Everything felt strangely calm. They believed they had won. They believed the signatures meant surrender. They believed I had finally become what they needed me to be: weak, confused, manageable. They didn't understand what they had actually done. They had documented their intent. They had crossed a line that couldn't be reframed as concern or protection, and they had done it willingly, eagerly, without hesitation. That night, I slept deeply. Not because I was exhausted, but because for the first time since the wedding, the uncertainty was gone. The hardest part was over. The rest would unfold on its own, driven not by my anger, but by their actions. When morning came, the room was quiet again. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting pale lines across the floor. I sat up slowly, my movements measured, and reached for the glass of water on the tray. They were already moving, making calls, celebrating quietly, planning the next steps of a future they believed was secure. They had no idea that the document they never read was already closing around them, and there would be no way out. Morning came quietly, the way it always does, when something irreversible has already happened. Pale light filtered through the blinds, cutting the room into narrow bands of gold and shadow. I sat at the edge of the bed, fully dressed, fully alert, listening to the building wake up around me. Somewhere a cart rattled. Somewhere a door closed. Life continuing, unaware that a line had been crossed. They thought they had won. I didn't hear from my son that morning. That wasn't surprising. Victory makes people busy. There are calls to place plans, to confirm futures, to rearrange. Silence in moments like that is a sign of confidence. I left the hospital on my own terms. No escort, no fuss. The discharge papers were routine, the smiles professional. I thanked everyone politely and walked out into the cool air, feeling steadier with each step. Weakness, when worn convincingly, has a way of sharpening the senses once you take it off. By the time I reached home, the first signs were already there. An email notification waited on my phone, brief and impersonal. Transaction initiated. No explanation, no context. Just a confirmation that something had moved. I didn't open it right away. I made myself breakfast instead. Toast, coffee. The familiar motions grounded me. I sat at the table where I had eaten countless meals over the years, some rushed, some celebratory, some painfully quiet. I took my time. When I finally opened the email, it was exactly what I expected. A large transfer, framed as operational restructuring. Nothing overtly illegal. Nothing that would alarm anyone who didn't know how to read between the lines. They were moving fast, faster than they should have. Impatience always gives itself away. A second message followed not long after this one, forwarded by someone who assumed I was still in the loop. It referenced a meeting scheduled for later that afternoon. Strategy, integration, next steps. My name appeared once in passing, attached to a phrase that made my jaw tighten. Given Walter's condition, we should proceed without delay. Condition, not health. Condition. A word chosen carefully, neutral enough to avoid offense, vague enough to justify anything. I closed the message and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. They weren't waiting for confirmation. They believed they already had it. By noon, the calls began. Not to me, around me. An old colleague reached out, voice cautious. "I heard there were some changes," he said. Just wanted to make sure everything was all right. Everything's fine, I told him. And for the first time, I meant it. Later, a neighbor mentioned seeing my daughter-in-law at a luncheon downtown, holding court like someone used to being deferred to. She spoke openly, apparently, about transitions and responsibility, about how difficult it was to care for someone in decline. The audacity of it didn't shock me. What shocked me was how quickly she felt comfortable saying it out loud. That afternoon, I received my first missed call from my son, then a second, then a third. I didn't answer. I could picture him perfectly pacing phone, pressed to his ear, confidence fraying at the edges. He had expected immediate compliance from the world. He had expected the systems to align smoothly behind him. When they didn't, confusion would set in. Confusion is the first crack. By early evening, the tone of the messages changed. The careful phrasing disappeared, replaced by urgency. "Dad, we need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding. Call me. Please." I read each one without reacting, then set the phone face down on the table. Across town, I knew they were celebrating, at least in their own way, not with champagne or speeches, but with relief. With that particular satisfaction that comes when you believe a problem has been handled cleanly, efficiently. They didn't know yet that efficiency can be a trap. Margaret called just before sunset. Her voice was calm, steady. "They've initiated the transfer," she said. "Exactly as we expected. And the documentation in place," she replied. "Time-stamped, verified, no ambiguity." I smiled faintly. Good. There was a pause. "Are you ready for what comes next?" "I've been ready since the wedding," I said. After the call, I went for a walk. The neighborhood was quiet children, riding bikes, couples, walking dogs. Ordinary life, unfolding without drama. I wondered how many of them had faced moments where they realized the people closest to them were not who they thought they were, probably more than anyone likes to admit. When I returned home, the phone was buzzing again. This time, I answered. "Dad," my son said immediately, relief flooding his voice. "Thank God. There's been a problem." "What kind of problem?" I asked calmly. "The bank," he said. "They flagged something. It's probably nothing, just a delay, but I prompted. "But we need you to confirm a few things," he said, just to smooth it out. "Confirm." The word hung in the air, heavy with irony. "I'm resting," I said. "I'm not in a position to review anything right now." There was silence on the line. Then his voice tightened. "This is important." "I'm sure it is," I replied. "That's why you should let the professionals handle it." He didn't respond right away. When he did, the confidence was gone. "Emily's getting nervous," he admitted. That told me everything. "She should be," I said, and ended the call. As night settled in, the messages escalated, not just from my son, but from numbers I didn't recognize. Advisors, intermediaries, people suddenly eager to speak with me directly, to clarify, to reassure. I ignored them all. Around 10, Margaret sent a short text. They crossed the line. I closed my eyes and let the weight of it settle. They had moved beyond maneuvering, beyond interpretation. They had acted on authority they didn't fully understand, triggering consequences they couldn't reverse. Somewhere, perhaps over dinner or drinks, my daughter-in-law was still smiling, still telling herself that control had been secured. Somewhere, my son was beginning to realize that something was very wrong, that silence was no longer working in his favor. I didn't feel satisfaction. Not yet. What I felt was inevitability. This was no longer about me. The systems were awake now. Banks, auditors, legal frameworks that didn't care about family dynamics or wedding humiliations. They cared about structure, about signatures, about responsibility. I went to bed that night and slept soundly. When I woke, there was a single new message waiting for me. It wasn't long. "Can we talk?" I stared at it for a moment, then placed the phone back on the nightstand. They weren't asking for permission anymore. They weren't even asking for understanding. They were asking for mercy. I turned off the light and lay there in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Tomorrow I would step back into the world they had tried to take from me. Tomorrow the consequences would become visible. But tonight, I let them sit with the uncertainty they had created. They had believed the story was over. In truth, it was only just beginning. The first call came while I was standing at the kitchen counter, Slicing an apple with a knife I'd owned longer than my son had been alive. The phone buzzed once, then stopped. I didn't look at it. I finished slicing, arranged the pieces on a plate, and carried it to the table before checking the screen. Unknown number. Voicemail left. I didn't listen to it yet. I had learned that urgency loses its edge when you refuse to meet it on its own terms. By the time I finished eating, there were 3 more missed calls. 2 from my son. 1 from a number I recognized as belonging to an institution that never called unless something had gone wrong. The floor was starting to give way. I sat down in my study and finally listened to the voicemail from the unknown number. The voice was professional, neutral, and careful in the way people sound when they are trying not to alarm you. This is a courtesy call regarding a transaction review. We'll need to speak with you directly to clarify a few details. Clarify. Another gentle word. Clarification is what comes before consequences. I didn't return the call. Instead, I opened my laptop and logged into the account they thought they had secured. The interface loaded slowly, as if even the system itself needed a moment to catch up with what had been triggered. A red banner appeared across the top of the screen. Action pending. Review in progress. They had expected movement. What they got was friction. My phone rang again, this time my son's number flashing insistently. I let it ring until it stopped, then immediately rang again. When I finally answered, his voice spilled out too fast. "Dad, thank you. I'm glad you picked up. There's been a delay, but it's nothing serious, just a routine check. Routine checks don't usually come with that many calls," I said. He laughed, thin and unconvincing. "You know how these things are. Compliance departments get jumpy." "And what are they jumpy about?" I asked. There was a pause. A real one. Not a breath. A calculation. "They just need confirmation," he said. "From you. Confirmation. Always the same ask. Validation of authority they hadn't earned." "I'm not available today," I replied. "I'm resting." "Dad," he said, the word tightening in his throat. "This is important." "I'm sure it feels that way," I said calmly. "That doesn't make it my emergency." I hung up before he could respond. The silence afterward was louder than any argument. I sat back in my chair and waited. By early afternoon, the ripple effects had begun. I received an email from a longtime associate, someone who hadn't contacted me directly in years. "Just wanted to check in. Heard there might be some restructuring happening. Hope you're well." I deleted it without replying. Another message arrived, this one from a junior executive who had once asked me for advice over coffee. "Is everything okay?" People are asking questions. People were always asking questions when power shifted unexpectedly. The next call I did answer. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to hear how far the panic had traveled. It was a banker I had worked with for decades. His tone was polite, but strained the way men sound when they are navigating something that has suddenly grown teeth. "Walter," he said, "we've encountered a complication." "What kind?" I asked. "There's a discrepancy between the authority presented and the structure on file," he said carefully. "We need to resolve that before proceeding." "Resolved how?" I asked. "With documentation," he said. "And clarification of intent." Intent. That word again. "I see," I said. "And what happens until then?" "Until then," he said, "everything remains paused." Paused. Not reversed, not canceled. Paused. I thanked him and ended the call. My hands were steady. My breathing even. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The point where confidence meets reality and loses. Across town, I knew the mood was shifting. What had begun as irritation was turning into anxiety. When systems don't respond the way you expect, the problem stops being theoretical. The next call came from my daughter-in-law. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was longer than the others, her voice controlled but sharp at the edges. "Walter, we need to speak immediately. There's been a misunderstanding, and your involvement is necessary to clear it up. Necessary, not requested, not invited." I smiled faintly and set the phone down. By late afternoon, the whispers had turned into murmurs. A meeting scheduled for that evening was abruptly postponed. An invitation was quietly rescinded. Someone I barely knew reached out through a mutual contact to ask if I was doing all right. Reputations crack before they shatter. This was the sound of the first fissures. My son called again, as the sun began to sink his voice, no longer pretending at calm. Dad, he said, almost pleading now. We didn't expect this. The transfer should have gone through cleanly. Should have, I repeated. We followed the process, he insisted. We had the paperwork. Did you read it? I asked. The silence that followed told me everything. What's happening? He asked finally. Consequences, I said. They tend to arrive unannounced. He exhaled sharply. Emily thinks someone interfered. I'm sure she does, I replied. This is serious, he said. They're asking questions about the source of authority, about intent. And what are you telling them? I asked. That you're resting, he said, that you approved everything. I closed my eyes for a moment, not in anger, in acceptance. I didn't approve anything, I said evenly. And you know that. You signed, he said, desperation creeping in. I signed what you put in front of me, I replied. Those are not always the same thing. The line went dead, not disconnected, just silent. I imagined him standing there, phone pressed to his ear, the weight of realization finally settling in. As evening deepened into night, the final confirmation arrived. Margaret called, her voice steady, almost detached. They're escalating, she said. Compliance has flagged it. Legal is involved now. Good, I said. There will be questions, she continued. Formal ones. I'm available, I replied, at the appropriate time. After the call ended, I sat alone in the darkened study, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. The house felt different now, not heavier, lighter, as if something that had been pressing down on it had finally been lifted. They had believed the hardest part was convincing me to step aside. They had been wrong. The hardest part was always the aftermath, when the systems you underestimate begin to speak. Near midnight, my phone buzzed one last time. A single message from my son. Please, we need to talk. I didn't respond. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet street. Somewhere not far away, I knew my son and his wife were arguing, blame shifting, plans unraveling. The confidence that had carried them this far collapsing under the weight of questions they couldn't answer. They weren't asking for permission anymore. They were asking for mercy. I turned away from the window and shut off the light. Tomorrow I would step back into the spaces they had tried to take from me. Tomorrow everything would be said out loud in rooms where silence could no longer protect anyone. But tonight I let the floor finish, dropping out from under them. They had pushed me aside at a wedding, believing that was enough to erase me. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I arrived early, not because I needed the time, but because I wanted to see the room before anyone else filled it with noise. The conference center sat on the edge of the city, all glass and steel, designed to look transparent while hiding everything that mattered behind layers of policy and procedure. I signed in under my own name. No titles, no assistants, just Walter Hayes. The woman at the front desk glanced at the screen, then back at me, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. They're expecting you? She said, suddenly more careful. I nodded and followed her down the hall. Inside the boardroom, the lights were still dimmed. A long table stretched across the space, polished to a mirror finish. At the far end sat a stack of folders, neatly arranged, each one marked with a label I recognized. My handwriting, my system. They had been pulled from archives no one thought I'd ever ask to see again. I took a seat at the head of the table, not as a statement, as a fact. By the time the others began to arrive, the air had changed. Conversations died mid-sentence when they saw me. A few men nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact. Chairs scraped softly. As people settled into places they suddenly weren't sure they still owned. My son entered last. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, in posture. His shoulders were tight, his jaw clenched, his confidence frayed around the edges. He didn't sit near me. He took a seat 2 places down, close enough to feel exposed, far enough to pretend distance. Emily followed him, her expression. Controlled eyes, sharp, scanning the room the way predators do when they sense danger. She smiled when she saw me. It didn't reach her eyes. The meeting began with formalities, introductions, a review of the agenda, words that sounded important but carried no weight. Everyone knew why we were there. When it was time, I stood. No one interrupted me. I won't take long, I said. I prefer clarity over ceremony. I could feel my son tense beside me. There has been an attempt to execute a transaction under my authority without my consent, I continued. That alone would warrant review, but what concerns me more is the assumption behind it. I let that settle. The assumption I said that my silence equaled surrender. A murmur moved through the room. I turned slightly, not to face my son, but so he could hear every word clearly. I stepped back years ago because I believed succession required trust, I said, not erasure. I never relinquished responsibility. I never abdicated oversight. I simply stopped speaking. I opened one of the folders in front of me. That was interpreted as weakness. Emily shifted in her seat. I began laying out the timeline. Dates, documents, signatures, not accusations, evidence. Each point landed cleanly unemotional, impossible to dispute. The room grew quieter with every sentence. When I reached the final document, I paused. This, I said, holding it up, is where the error became fatal. I explained the structure, the contingency, the clause no one had bothered to read because they were too busy congratulating themselves. I didn't look at my son while I spoke. I didn't need to. I could feel him unraveling. This meeting, I concluded, is not about punishment. It's about correction. The chairwoman cleared her throat. Mr. Hayes, she said carefully, what exactly are you proposing I'm not proposing? I replied, I'm informing. I outlined the changes. Immediate suspension of certain authorities, reassignment of oversight, a restructuring that returned control to where it legally belonged, to me. Emily stood abruptly. This is outrageous, she said. You can't just walk in and take over. I turned to her for the first time. I didn't walk in, I said. I was never out. My son finally spoke. Dad, he said, his voice tight. This doesn't have to be hostile. No, I agreed. It doesn't. But it does have to be honest. I faced him fully now. You were silent when I was humiliated, I said quietly. You were vocal when you thought I was gone. That tells me everything I need to know. His face flushed. I was trying to keep the peace. You were trying to keep the benefits, I replied. No one interrupted. Not this time. By the end of the meeting, the outcome was no longer in question. Votes were taken, decisions recorded, authority restored, with the kind of precision only lawyers and accountants can achieve. When it was over, people filed out quickly, avoiding conversation, eager to distance themselves from the fallout. My son remained seated, staring at the table. Emily whispered something to him, sharp and urgent, then left without looking back. He stayed. I gathered my papers slowly, giving him time to find his voice. I didn't think you'd actually do it, he said finally. That's the problem, I replied. You didn't think. He looked up at me, then eyes red, stripped of pretense. What happens now? I considered him for a long moment. Now, I said, you live with what you chose. I walked out of the room without waiting for his response. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the glass facade. I paused at the entrance, breathing in the cool evening air. The city moved around me, indifferent, relentless, alive. For the first time in a long while, I felt aligned with it. The humiliation at the wedding had been public. This reckoning had been quieter, more permanent. I didn't need applause. I didn't need apologies. I had reclaimed what mattered, and tomorrow the final consequences would begin to unfold. The first call came just after dawn. I was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table in my townhouse, a cup of black coffee cooling beside my hand. Old habits die hard. When you spend a lifetime waiting for concrete to cure and steel to set, your body learns to wake before the world does. The phone vibrated once, then stopped. I didn't answer. I already knew who it was. 5 minutes later, it rang again. This time, I let it go to voicemail. Dad, my son said, his voice tight and unsteady. Please, we need to talk. There's been confusion. Emily is panicking. The attorneys are saying things that don't make sense. Just call me back. I set the phone face down on the table. Confusion was the word people use when reality finally arrives and refuses to negotiate. By mid-morning, the messages stacked up. My son, Emily, 2 lawyers whose names I recognized from old invoices, 1 board member who had never once returned my calls when I still held the title everyone respected. Now they all wanted clarity. They didn't get it. I spent the morning doing something I hadn't done in years. I walked through one of the older properties alone, no entourage, no assistance, just me and the echo of my own footsteps. The building was scheduled for renovation. concrete floors exposed, beams stripped bare. The smell of dust and old oil hung in the air. I ran my hand along a column I remembered pouring myself decades ago, back when my hands were stronger and my ambitions simpler. This was the part they never understood. Power doesn't come from signatures or meetings. It comes from knowing what something is worth because you built it. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. Emily, this is going too far. You're humiliating him now. Is that what you wanted? I stared at the words for a long moment before typing a response. You humiliated me first. I'm just no longer pretending it didn't matter. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and kept walking. By early afternoon, the inevitable happened. My son showed up. I heard him before I saw him, his shoes echoing too loudly in the open space. He looked out of place in the half-finished building, his tailored coat brushing against exposed concrete, his expression caught somewhere between anger and fear. You can't just ignore me, he said, his voice sharp with desperation. This affects my life. I turned slowly. So did the wedding, I said. He flinched. That wasn't supposed to go like that, he said. Emily's parents were drunk. Things got out of hand. And you stood there, I replied, silent. He rubbed his face, dragging his hands down like he was trying to wipe something off that wouldn't come away. I didn't know what to do, he said. I was trying to keep everyone calm. You were trying to stay comfortable, I said. There's a difference. He took a step toward me. You're destroying everything. I laughed, once a short sound that surprised even me. No, I said. I'm revealing it. The anger finally broke through his fear. You think you're righteous? He snapped. You think because you built something you get to control everyone forever. I looked at him carefully, then really looked at him. I never asked for obedience, I said. I asked for respect. You gave me silence instead. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. For the first time I saw it in his eyes. Not confusion, not anger, understanding. You planned this, he said quietly. You walked away on purpose. Yes, I replied. Because of 4 words, I shook my head. Because of everything those 4 words represented. He sank onto a stack of pallets, suddenly exhausted. What happens to me now, he asked. That was the question he should have asked years ago. That depends, I said, on whether you're willing to live without the safety net you mistook for love. He looked up sharply. What does that mean? It means I said that I'm not fixing this for you. His face drained of color. You're my father. I was, I said evenly. I still am, but I won't be your shield anymore. He stood abruptly. So that's it. You take everything back and leave me with nothing. I met his gaze without flinching. I'm leaving you with exactly what you earned, I said. He left without another word, his footsteps fading down the corridor, swallowed by the hollow space of unfinished walls. That night, the house was quiet. I sat alone reviewing documents one last time. Not because I needed to, because I wanted certainty. The legal structure was airtight. Ownership transferred, authority reassigned, protections removed. There would be no dramatic court battle, no public spectacle, just consequences unfolding the way they always do, one decision at a time. Near midnight, my phone rang again. This time I answered. It was Emily. Her voice was different now, controlled, calculated. We can still fix this, she said. You don't have to do what you're planning. I'm not planning anything. I replied, I've already done it. You're isolating yourself, she said. People will think you're bitter, unstable. I smiled to myself. They already did, I said. That's why this worked. There was a pause on the line. You won't win, she said quietly. I already did, I replied. I just stopped pretending I lost. I hung up before she could respond. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep that comes only after a long internal war finally ends. The next morning, the final piece fell into place. The announcement went out just after 9. Clean, professional, irreversible. Resignations followed, some voluntary, some not. By noon, the structure I had built, lost, and reclaimed no longer belonged to any single name, and that was intentional. By evening, I stood alone in the empty lobby of a building that once bore my family name in polished steel letters. The sign had already been removed, leaving a faint outline on the stone. I didn't feel loss. I felt release. The phone in my pocket remained silent. No more calls, no more bargaining. They finally understood. Tomorrow, I would decide what came next, not for them. For me, the house felt different once the noise was gone, not empty, cleansed. I stood in the living room just after sunrise, the light cutting across the hardwood floors at a low angle, revealing dust motes drifting lazily in the air. For years, this room had been filled with voices that talked over one another, opinions that demanded space they never earned. Now there was only the quiet hum of the furnace and the distant sound of traffic beginning its day. I breathed easier than I had in a long time. On the mantel sat a single photograph I had retrieved the night before, when no one else ever seemed to notice. It was old, the edges worn soft. My late wife and I stood in front of the first building we ever completed together. No suits, no ceremony, just two tired people smiling because something real stood behind us. That was the legacy they never understood. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the dining table alone, the same table where I once hosted holidays and endured polite silences. I didn't miss those days. I missed the version of myself that believed love meant endless patience. Silence, I had learned, can be generous, but it can also be permission. At the wedding, I had finally withdrawn that permission. I replayed the moment in my mind, not with anger, but with clarity. The way the room had leaned toward the cruelty like it was entertainment. The way my son had stood still, saying nothing, hoping the moment would pass without demanding anything of him. People like to believe humiliation happens suddenly. It doesn't. It arrives after years of small concessions. The 4 words I spoke before I walked away were not planned. They rose out of something older than thought, older than pride. They were not loud. They didn't need to be. They were the end of negotiation. By late morning, the calls resumed. Not from my son this time, from people who had watched quietly for years and now sensed a shift. Old colleagues, former partners, even a distant cousin who had never once visited without an agenda. I didn't answer most of them. When you spend a lifetime being available, absence becomes your strongest statement. Instead, I drove, out past the city limits, beyond the glass buildings and manicured entrances, to a property I hadn't visited in years. A training yard, unremarkable at first glance. Concrete pads, steel frames, equipment worn from honest use. This was where I learned the most important lessons of my life. I walked the grounds slowly, greeting a few workers who looked surprised to see me, but nodded with respect that wasn't forced. They didn't know about weddings or boardrooms or family drama. They knew weight, weather, time. One of the younger men approached, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're Walter Hayes, right?" he asked. I nodded. "My dad worked for you," he said you showed up before everyone else and left last. I smiled faintly. "Your dad had good memory." He hesitated, then added, "This place, it's changing." "Yes," I said, "it's becoming what it was always meant to be." He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. That afternoon, I finalized the last document. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no confrontation, just ink on paper and intention behind it. The family structure was dissolved, not out of spite, out of precision. Everything I had built, every asset and holding that mattered, was transferred into a foundation, one designed to train, to mentor, to give opportunity without entitlement. A place where people learned the value of what they earned, not what they inherited. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent decades trying to give my son an easier life. In doing so, I had taken something essential away from him. Struggle is not cruelty. It is instruction. As evening fell, I returned home. The house greeted me without expectation. I made a simple dinner and ate standing by the counter, the way I used to when deadlines were tight and money tighter. I didn't feel lonely. I felt aligned. There was a knock at the door just after dark. I already knew who it was. My son stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. He looked older than he had a week ago. Not wiser, just stripped. "I didn't come to argue," he said quickly. I didn't know where else to go. I studied him for a long moment. "You always knew where to go," I said. "You just didn't like the cost." He swallowed. "Emily left." I nodded. That too was inevitable. She said I was a bad investment, he added, his voice breaking slightly. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, careful not to invite him in by accident. She was honest, I said. You should thank her for that. He looked at me, eyes wet, waiting for something I had given him his entire life, a rescue. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a card. This is a foreman, I trust, I said, handing it to him. They're short-handed. The work is hard. The pay is honest. He stared at it like it was written in another language. You want me to do that? He asked. I want you to build something, I replied, even if it's just yourself. He shook his head slowly. And if I don't, then you'll learn a different lesson, I said, but it won't be mine to teach. I handed him a small amount of cash, enough for a bus ticket, enough for a meal, not enough to hide behind. Do not call me, I said gently. Do not ask for help, not until you can tell me what you've earned with your own hands. He nodded, tears freezing at the corners of his eyes. When he turned away, I didn't stop him. Some goodbyes are meant to be quiet. I went back inside and locked the door. Later that night, I sat at my desk, the observer badge resting in the corner where it had been since the wedding. A piece of plastic, cheap, insignificant. And yet, it had marked the moment everything changed. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand, then set it back down. Observation is not weakness. It is patience. It is restraint. It is knowing when not to act, so that when you do, it cannot be ignored. I looked around the room one last time before turning off the light. The house no longer felt like a monument to what I had lost. It felt like a foundation. The years ahead would be quieter, smaller in some ways, larger in others. I would teach again, build again, watch young men and women learn what it means to earn something real. And maybe one day my son would return, not as a child asking to be protected, but as a man ready to stand. If that day never came, I would still be at peace, because dignity reclaimed is worth more than inheritance preserved. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been taken for granted or forced to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. These stories live because of conversation, and your perspective matters. If you want to hear more stories about family boundaries and what it really means to take your life back, stay with the channel and subscribe. Sometimes the hardest decision is walking away, but it's often the one that finally lets you come home.